So I'm the new extension weed specialist for field crops at Penn State. I just started in September. I replaced Bill Curran, who was there for a whole career. And my experience with organic agriculture really focused on participating in the Reduced-tillage organic systems experiment at Penn State. So I did a postdoc there for about 3.5 years and was the project coordinator for this systems experiment. And so most of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be related to what we've learned in this long-term cropping systems experiment. And I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of folks behind that. So some of this work started in the early 2000s. We got some funding from the USDA OREI program to kind of have a broader multi-disciplinary project team to look at this. And so there's entomologists involved, agronomists, weed scientists, economists. And we've gone through a couple different cycles. The first 3 years was really focused on IPM practices in a reduced tillage organic systems experiment. And it included a couple different sites, including the USDA ARS at Beltsville and also in Delaware. The second phase of the project, and I'm going to talk a lot about today, just happened in State College at Penn State, but it kind of broadened the focus to not just looking at these high residue no-till planting semi-annual cash crops to alternative reduced tillage practices in an annual feed and forage rotation. And so it kind of had a pest management focus and a nutrient cycling focus. And we have a really good advisory team made up of industry as well as some on-farm collaborators that helped us with these projects. Okay, so just a little bit of an outline, what I'm hoping to cover, given enough time. Harriet asked me to talk a little more broadly about kind of weed ecology in these systems, and so I'm going to do a very brief kind of seed bank management and ecology 101 for a couple minutes. And then I'm going to kind of run through the different tactics that we have available to us, both in a full tillage system and also in these higher residue or reduced tillage systems, and how we might think about integrating different tactics to develop a really good IPM program. And then I'll start running through some case studies that we learned from this systems experiment at Penn State. I'll start with kind of focusing on what we've learned from comparing the high residue no-till soybean system to a full tillage system. I'll talk about, if I have time, about opportunities to really perennialize annual phases of the rotation by using winter grains in a reduced tillage with reduced tillage practices. And if I have time, I'll talk maybe just a few minutes about what we've learned from interseeding into field corn. Okay, so let me just spend a few minutes talking about weed seed banks in general. So here you have a diagram of a weed seed bank, and this is a very cartoonish diagram because you only see one type of seed. And in reality, you probably have 20 to 30 different weed species that are living in your weed seed banks. So that's one difference. Another difference is that those weed species are going to be different sizes, and that's important. And another thing is that they're going to be living in different locations within the soil profile. That's also an important factor. And the other really important factor is these species are going to differ in dormancy traits. And so we either have weed seeds that are asleep and dormant in the soil or ready to germinate. And so dormancy traits are an evolved, adaptive trait that tells weed seeds when conditions are suitable for completing its life cycle. And when those conditions are suitable, we see dormancy shut off and it's capable of germinating. If conditions aren't suitable for completing its life cycle, those seeds will remain dormant. Okay, and so that's a really important process, and it's really important when we think about how tillage practices influence that. But when we go to developing weed management plans in conventional ag, too often we get trapped in a crop protection mindset where the question is, how do I manage weeds during my cash crop growing season to prevent yields? And a better approach, a better long-term approach is to ask, how do I manage my weed seed bank? How do I drive down the density of weed seeds in my seed bank? And if that is your approach, you have a couple different options, generally speaking. And in the textbooks, we call this either expressive weed management, where the idea is you want to turn on those germination cues and get weeds out of the soil outside of a cash crop growing season window at times where you can easily control them just as they emerge. The other strategy is we want to keep weed seeds in the soil profile and prevent turning on germination cues, okay? And so these arrows, this is kind of a get them out strategy. This is my folksy suppressive and expressive weed management is kind of a very geeky terms. So I think about it as a get them out strategy when we want to get the weed seeds out, when we have tools that we can control them, or we want to try to keep them in and shut off germination cues. So how does tillage influence this dynamic? And so I think of tillage in two different ways. The intensity of the type of tillage that we're using. So whether we're using a moldboard plow, inversion tillage, chisel plow, all the way down to vertical tillage or cultivation. And also the frequency of tillage. How often are we having these disturbance events? Because the adaptation that's evolved in almost all of these annual weed seeds is related to disturbance. That's what triggers the germination cues, okay? Because they've adapted to arable environments that are high disturbance. And so the tillage cues include soil moisture changes, changes in light quality and quantity, oxygen levels indicate that you've just aerated the soil with the tillage pass, and therefore there's an open niche in the soil for those weeds to exploit. Temperature can drive germination cues. Even pulses of soil nitrate in the soil are an indicator that there's been a disturbance event and can also influence germination. Okay, and so there's also there's kind of a risk management strategy built into weed seed traits, in that it's not just one of those triggers that needs to be turned on for the weeds to germinate. Oftentimes it's 3 or 4 of those triggers that need to happen before we see weeds germinate in the soil. Okay, so how does tillage intensity influence those germination cues and ultimately weed seed establishment? And so there's been kind of primary research has shown that the tillage intensity is a driver of where they're located in the soil profile. So this axis is just 0 to 6 inches. You can think of that maybe as the plow layer. And you can see as we transition from inversion tillage with the moldboard plow to non-inversion tillage with the chisel plow to no-till, we're redistributing over time where the weed seeds are located in the soil profile. And it's going to also depend a little bit on soil texture. So when we're using inversion tillage, we're distributing weed seeds through that soil profile. And when we go to a no-till situation, we're concentrating the profile to the very top couple inches. Okay, so all the weed seeds are located in that top area. And if you think about the germination cues, we're going to have, in more cases, we're going to have those germinations, those 2 or 3 or 4 important germination cues turned on when those weed seeds are located closer to the soil profile. When weed seeds are buried at 6 inches, we may be turning some of those germination cues off. Okay? So that's one important factor in how tillage influences weed seed bank dynamics. The other thing is how frequently, or even really just the timing of tillage, how that influences germination and seedling emergence, okay? And so I mentioned it's multiple triggers that turn on germination, and so we typically see different patterns of germination occur in establishment. And so we think in terms of summer annual weeds, early emerging summer annual weeds. We have summer annual weeds that have multiple peaks or flushes of germination. We have late emerging summer annual weeds. And this is due to the fact that they have different traits in them and different germination cues, okay? And so if we understand a little bit about maybe what the 3 or 4 or 5 weed species that we're dealing with are in our system, if we understand what their traits are, their seed traits are, we can develop tactics around that to exploit them. Okay, so this just gives you a really nice illustration of how even just a slight change in the timing of a disturbance event can influence what your weed pressure is going to look like in any given year. So the only two differences, or the only difference between this side of the field and this side of the field is the timing of the primary tillage and secondary tillage and seedbed preparation. Okay, and so when they planted earlier, all that seedbed preparation took place in the middle of May, right when all the traits were turned on for a bunch of different species. Common ragweed, foxtail, you see some lamb's quarter in that picture. When we pushed, not we, this is a different study here, when seedbed preparation was just pushed back a couple weeks, 3 weeks into June, all of a sudden some of those germination cues were turned off. And a lot of those weed species now went into a secondary dormancy stage. And so they're in the soil profile waiting for another year to come around before that they might germinate. Okay, so that was a very brief weed seed bank dynamics 101. So I want to talk about how we can exploit those different vulnerable stages in the life cycles of different species with the different tactics that we have available to us, okay? So in a tillage-based system, we can use primary tillage events, and so the factors that are really going to drive the success and how we might be able to use those tools is the intensity that we're going with. So I showed you that picture that when we go with inversion, moldboard plowing, we have the opportunity to actually place those weed seeds deep in the soil profile and turn off germination cues. And so to the extent which that's a good strategy is going to depend on how frequently you are using moldboard plow events, because somebody earlier today talked about weed seed bank persistence. So weed species can persist for several years. Typically we think about about 80% of the weed fraction of the population that's in the weed seed bank for any particular species might last 3 to 5 years. A very small percentage can last a really long time. All right, so we typically think about 3 to 5 years of a window. So if a perennial forage phase follows a primary inversion tillage event in the rotation, we will potentially drive down the weed seed bank by burying those weed seeds. Okay, but if the frequency is, if we're using moldboard plowing on a yearly basis, all we're doing is burying those weed seeds and bringing them back up. And the thing that we typically see with a really intensive tillage rotation is that we see a weed species shift to larger seeded weed seeds that can germinate from deeper depths in the soil profile. Okay, so we see a shift in the weed community when we're relying on primary tillage as a weed management strategy. Okay, so I thought Sam Hitchcock yesterday did a really great job kind of outlining the hierarchy of tactics when it comes to cultivation and the importance of really starting. He started with understanding your weed seed bank. It's really density dependent. How many weed seeds we have in there is going to dictate how successful we are with cultivation. But after seedbed prep, what we've done is we've just turned on a bunch of germination cues. All right, so all that disturbance related to preparing a seedbed for a cash crop, and we're setting ourselves up for a period of vulnerability, and that's where blind cultivation or stale seedbed or false seedbed approach becomes particularly important. So just a few notes about blind cultivation. So we typically use a tine weeder. Somebody yesterday was talking about using a rotary hoe, which is a little more aggressive approach in comparison to a tine weeder. But the strategy really is to get the cash crop in the ground, and before it's up, you have a 5-6 day window maybe before you get the cash crop up. And in that upper profile, in the upper inch of that soil profile, you're going to have germination occur. And if we can hit weeds when they're at this white thread stage, right after germination, before they've even emerged, we can be really successful with blind cultivation. Okay? Once weed seeds get up and set a root or get a couple of leaves up, it becomes really difficult to get weeds out with tine weeding. So that's why Sam was talking about probably doing 1 or 2 passes of blind cultivation before the crop is up, and probably a couple cultivation passes after the cash crop is up. So there's good if some of you are new and are thinking about transitioning to organic and don't have a lot of experience with cultivation. There's a pretty good general guide out there called Steel in the Field. It's a SARE publication. I think you can download it free as a PDF, or you can purchase it for a pretty fair price and get yourself a hard copy. And it has kind of general rules for different cultivation implements as far as when they're effective in relationship to the crop stage. You have a question? It's called Steel in the Field. It's a pretty old publication, and I would say it's a good starting point. And it kind of gives you the broad suite of tools that you have and generally how you might use them. I think that things that Sam were talking about yesterday, you're probably not going to get out of that guide. I think kind of advances in cultivation that are being driven a lot by the European advancements really haven't been updated in this guide, but it's a good starting place. Okay, so this is what we're trying to prevent. We really think about blind cultivation as an in-row cultivation tool. It's an opportunity to control weeds that might emerge with the crop, in the crop row. Okay, and so this is just a good example of what happens when we don't have enough blind cultivation, or we didn't get good control with our blind cultivation. Okay, so we get weeds emerging with the crop. And so the idea is we want to do enough blind cultivation that we establish a size hierarchy where the crop is bigger than the weeds and becomes competitive with weeds in row. Okay, so inter-row cultivation. So Sam, again, he did a really great job detailing the different types of implements. And so as far as putting this into practice, and a few things that you might need to consider is, again, it's totally size dependent. So as soon as those weeds establish root systems, it becomes really difficult to be successful with inter-row cultivation. We typically think that annual grasses are a little tougher to control with inter-row cultivation in comparison to broadleaf weeds, and that's because of where the growing point is. And so grasses, the growing point is at the soil surface, at the crown. They get up and they spend a little more early season energy in putting down a root system, and so they're harder to tug out in comparison to a broadleaf weed. So it's somewhat weed species dependent. It's also going to be dependent on soil conditions. There's kind of a sweet spot for when you can be really effective. The other thing to consider is the intensity in which you would use the cultivation. So most row crop organic farmers in Pennsylvania are still using kind of hoe-type cultivator sweeps instead of kind of the higher residue sweeps that Sam was talking about yesterday. And so that's a very intensive disturbance, and we're trying to bury weed seeds. And one thing that you can do with that is try to throw some soil into the row to try to bury weeds that are emerging in the row that you might have missed with blind cultivation. The drawback, of course, is that when you're going at that depth, if you're going to throw soil in the row and you're going fast, you're going to go at a deeper depth, and that disturbance event might trigger another set another germination event to occur. And so Sam was talking about higher residue sweeps that do less disturbance and stay very shallow. And the idea behind those high residue sweeps is you control those weeds if they're small, but you don't do additional disturbance that would generate another flush of weeds coming out. Okay, so let's transition to some tactics in a more of a reduced tillage system. Okay, so everybody who was here yesterday probably saw lots of these types of pictures. So this is a very active area of research at Penn State as well. We call this the orange crush. So ours is orange, not red. We built it ourselves. It's been a workhorse. And so I want to talk about the mechanisms behind kind of this high residue mulch approach as far as weed control. So this is what it looks like when it works well. A nice mat there. When it works well in beans, That's a particularly weed-free year right there. But what's really going on? And so I'm sure you've heard a lot about, and I heard this morning about the importance of having really a lot of biomass there to have a nice suppressive mulch throughout the year. And the reason why that's important is because when we have a really thick mulch in place, we're altering germination cues, and probably the most important is we're shutting off the light quality and quantity that triggers germination in a lot of weed seeds. Okay, and so not all weed seeds are sensitive to light, but a lot are. They need that flash of light, or they need a change in light quality in order to germinate. Okay, and so what happens is here we have the same particular plant, and it's germinating in the presence of the types of light in the spectrum that they need to photosynthesize. And in comparison, you have a plant that has germinated in darkness without those cues. And so light-insensitive plants, when they germinate, if they don't have the particular spectrum of light they need, their strategy is to keep going, so hypocotyl elongation. And if that's a particularly small seeded weed species with a small amount of energy reserves to be able to spend to get up and out in order to start photosynthesizing and producing more energy, it's going to be pretty stressed and less competitive. And so in a really high mulch environment, we might have fatal germination where it never makes it out of that mulch because it exhausts its resources trying to get out. Okay, so biomass is important, and the reason why is because of this physical suppression and how it promotes resource exhaustion. But there's a couple other things that that high biomass does, and particularly for cereal rye when we're trying to delay termination to generate increased biomass. The other thing that we're doing is we're driving up C to N ratios. And when we do that, that means that we're going to have a more persistent mulch on the surface through the cash crop growing season. Okay, so lower C to N ratios, we're going to see faster breakdown of the mulch. The other important thing from a weed management strategy is we're immobilizing more nitrogen. So that rye plant is scavenging nitrogen throughout the fall and spring growing season. And as those C to N ratios go up, it's immobilizing some of that nitrogen, which means that nitrogen is not available, less available for weeds to take advantage of. And finally, when we're delaying termination in order to achieve all three of those things, we're shifting the timing of disturbance, just from the roller crimper or whatever our termination method is, and from planting events. Okay, so this kind of shows you, this is from some research that was done at Penn State several years ago, and it just demonstrates some of the different mechanisms at play. So we're terminating, comparing early termination at the beginning or late April, and the difference in just delaying termination 3 weeks. Several things happen. We almost tripled the biomass, okay? And when we tripled the biomass and delayed termination by 3 weeks, we drove down weed abundance in the middle of the cash crop growing season by about 60%. The other thing that they saw is a shift in what the primary weeds were. Okay, so here, these lighter bars are pigweed, these darker bars are ragweed, and you can see that earlier in the season we have a lot of ragweed, and I showed that initial emergence periodicity chart. Ragweed is about the earliest germinating summer annual we have. So probably what's occurring there is it's germinating before we roll down the cash crop, and it can survive the roller crimper, and it becomes the more dominant plant in that community. Here we see decreasing amounts of pigweed as we delay termination. So it's a later emerging, that's a later emerging summer annual weed. We have greater biomass that's persisting longer. Pigweed is also very sensitive and responsive to pulses and soil nitrate. So if we're tying up soil nitrate, we're making pigweed less competitive. And so there's probably several mechanisms at play for producing shifts in different weed species. Okay, so a lot of people have questions about allelopathy as one of the mechanisms for rye and other cereals and other cover crops for suppressing weeds. And I just wanted to point this out that a lot of the primary research that's been done on potential for allelopathy in rye species was done at North Carolina State. So when we're looking at some of this data, take that into account that this is a much warmer growing season. But what they found is that the earlier in the growing season, or in the phenological stage of rye, is when the concentration of DBOA, which is what they know is the allelopathic chemical that's in the plant, its highest concentration is early in the growing season, in the vegetative state. And as rye completes its phenological development, its concentrations go down, okay? And so when we think about what's the contribution of allelopathy from, say, a rolled rye mulch, it's probably pretty limited in comparison to some of those other mechanisms I was talking about, because the concentrations are going to be pretty low. If you're terminating your rye cover crop with tillage early, when it's in that vegetative state, that's when you're more likely to have soluble allelopathic chemicals in soil solution that can inhibit weed seeds. But it's also quite often a time where we don't see weed seed germination in summer annuals. It's a little too early. So I'm not suggesting that allelopathy doesn't play a role, but what I am suggesting is as we move into higher residue environments, it's probably less likely to be the driving mechanism. Yes?
Are those readily leached with excessive rain?
I think yes. So these are highly soluble compounds. And so the potential for leaching is there, particularly probably in early season, I would say. So it can, and it doesn't take much. It's not necessarily leaching like when we think about nitrogen loss. All it needs to do is leach below the profile in which the weed seeds are germinating, right? So if our weed seeds are concentrated in that upper soil surface, we may have, it might be in soil solution below that surface. And as the weeds germinate and establish root systems and the root systems get bigger, it's going to have a less of an inhibitory effect. It's got to be a pretty small weed seed for it to have an effect.
So should we double span the rye readily with all of the spray to keep that expression at grade?
I think that's probably, so double stacking rye as far as just trying to promote having that solution. So I'm not sure. I guess my first guess would be that that's probably, the allelopathic potential is fairly ephemeral, and it needs to be in place when we have weed seedlings emerging. And so I'm not sure that's going to be your best strategy. Okay, so one other note about, I just wanted to mention, I'm probably going to talk more about rye and soybeans than I am about no-till, organic no-till corn, but we have been working on that, and this particular research was done down at Beltsville with our collaborators, Stephen Mirsky at the USDA ARS station. And the primary focus of this research was, we've heard a lot about nitrogen credits that we can attribute to growing some big hairy vetch, right? We can produce a lot of nitrogen. And really the strategy should be not so much how much nitrogen we can produce, but synchronizing plant available nitrogen from hairy vetch with corn demand, right? So we know that there's peak phases of corn nitrogen demand, and that might not align if we're relying on these cover crops breaking down at the right time. And so the work was really trying to understand how we can change mixtures, the mixture rates and the composition of a rye vetch mixture in order to optimize the release curve of nitrogen so that we're maximizing the amount of nitrogen that's available at like the V5 corn growth stage. The other thing that has a really important, mixtures has a really important effect on weeds. So you can see here we have 100% monoculture of hairy vetch. Here we have 100% monoculture of rye and these various different mixtures in between. And we have the highest weed pressure where we have the highest amount of hairy vetch in monoculture, and the reason why is probably is twofold. The lack of persistence of the mulch, right? So we're going to have lower C to N ratio, so that mulch is not going to stick around as long. The other thing is we're probably having lots of early season plant available nitrogen being available to things like pigweed, and so we're seeing higher pressure. So when we're trying to do this, where we're trying to get a legume grass mixture in place to feed a corn crop, it also has important implications for weed management. Okay, so if we're using this approach, what are some of the other tactics that we can build in to make it successful? Because we know certainly the biomass production drives weed suppression potential. We know that we're not going to hit those thresholds that we're trying to hit every year. So what are the other tactics that we can have in place to be successful? So we did some work early on. The first Rose project looked at the difference between these high residue rolled rye situations were on 30-inch spacing versus putting the splitters on and growing them on 15-inch rows. 15-inch rows, we weren't high residue cultivating. 30-inch rows, we were. So that's one strategy. The other thing we think is important, and I'm guessing this might have been covered yesterday morning. I didn't make in time to see some of the talks, but we think high seeding rates are really important for a couple different reasons. One is we want to make sure that we're getting good stand establishment, all right? So we need competitive cash crops in the row to compete with weeds. And there's some research that's demonstrated that these higher seeding rates also may contribute to a little faster canopy closure. And so both of those have important implications for trying to suppress weeds, okay? So when we do no-till rye in organic systems, we're probably at 225 we're putting down. My colleague at Cornell, Matt Ryan, is even going higher at higher rates, and he suggests that it's worth the extra seed costs. The other thing that we've been using is, again, in these situations where we don't get as much biomass potential as we need, we've been using high-residue cultivators. So I'm not sure if this was covered yesterday either, but basically they're set up as one broad, flat sweep. So this particular John Deere implement's about a little over 20 inches wide, so you have 5 inches on either side, a little bit of wiggle room. And some of the research that was done by my predecessor, Bill Kern, suggests that 2 passes is probably better than 1. And we can use this implement a little later. We can go about 4 to 5 weeks after planting. And the reason why we can do that is the strategy is we're slicing roots from shoots rather than burying weed seeds. So we can target bigger weeds with a high residue cultivator. We can let them get up and still be somewhat effective. So this is just showing you the high residue cultivator without the mulch in place. And I'm not sure how much you can see, but I think this might be a foxtail where it looks like we might have severed the roots from the shoots there. Here, we didn't sever the roots from the shoots, but we displaced that particular weed species. Looks like we didn't get the yellow nutsedge right there. So this is what it looks like. So it's very sensitive to soil moisture conditions, just like a traditional inter-row cultivation in a full tillage system. We're trying to run this at about a 2-inch depth in the soil profile. And so you can see this is what it looks like when it works pretty well and the soil conditions are right. Sometimes the soil conditions aren't right, and you can what happens is you end up having a little higher disturbance if it's a little too cloddy. And a lot of times what happens is what you do is you end up pushing the rye residue into the row. And so what we found is that we should be using this implement adaptively. So in the first couple of years, we were using an experiment where we wanted to measure the difference between using this implement each year with a very strict protocol of using 2 passes versus not. And what we found is in years where it got dry later in the season, when we opened up that rye residue and parted it, we lost the benefits of soil moisture conservation from having that rye residue in place. And so we ended up taking a little bit of a yield drag, and the reason why we took a yield drag is we didn't have enough weed pressure for that cultivation to matter, okay? We also do this in corn, and so this is just a picture. I'm loading up this like what it looks like when it works well, right? So it also, you can run into troubles. It's all soil moisture condition dependent, and it's a learning process. And there's not one particular thing I can recommend as far as an adjustment. It's really just, I'm sure you guys all know, it's just a learning process over time for knowing when the conditions are right for making this effective tool. Okay, so I'm going to try to walk through a couple case studies. And so this is a very complicated map of our different systems that we've been looking at over a 3-year rotation. I don't want to detail everything, but so the past 3 years in the Rose project, what we wanted to concentrate was the benefits and the contrasts of no-till organic approach for corn and soybeans in comparison to full tillage. And in areas where we are using full tillage and summer annual cash crops, we were looking for opportunities for establishing either the fall cover crop or winter grains using no-till or reduced-till practices. Again, we're in a 3-year annual rotation: corn, soybeans, and spelt. Yep. Why spelt? Yeah, it's related to wheat. It's an ancient grain. And the reason why we use it is you can establish it a little bit later than wheat. So we're establishing after soybeans. And so if it comes off a little bit late and you do the necessary seedbed prep, it tends to get going even in later fall a little bit better than wheat does. There's a pretty good market for it. We have a lot of plain folk, Amish or Mennonite growers that particularly like this species in Pennsylvania. And we actually have a pretty good market in Pennsylvania for spelt. It's got some pretty good nutritional properties to it. Okay, so what we learned from the first rotation in rows is when we looked at 30-inch soybeans versus 15-inch rows, was that over time, and we did this across 3 different sites, we found that purely looking at weed management, we had lower weed pressure when we were on 30-inch rows and could use the high-residue cultivator in comparison to the 15-inch rows. And so the yield limiting factor was really how well we did as far as soybean population stands. And so the original kind of setup was we wanted a lot of weight on the planter, we wanted the right coulter, we wanted the right trash wheels, etc. And we consistently still had problems with establishing stands. So we made the decision, which had an important weed management implication, to move to the Charlie Martin rollers, which Don now sells. And so for the past 4 years, we've been using this implement to do our rolling. And the decision we made was we thought it was more important to get a consistent stand established and soybeans in place. And we were willing to take the trade-off of having a little more disturbance in row and the potential for some weed pressure in row. But we wanted to see how that played out. I think I heard Joe yesterday say that this works well in corn, and I just threw this in, and I'm going to talk about soybeans, and I just want to throw this picture in. Our experience is this doesn't work well in corn, and the reason why is we're sending, if you're sending the tractor, the first thing going through a 6-foot-tall hairy vetch cereal rye mixture is the tractor, followed by these roller crimpers on the planter. There's a lot of edges and a lot of steel for things to get ripped and pulled out, and it's hard to set and adjust the profile for those row cleaners to be successful in that situation. And so we're moving away from using the integrated roller system and going back to the orange crush for no-till corn. Okay, so we're comparing the no-till approach to organic full-tillage soybeans. We're using inversion tillage as our primary tillage tool. We're adaptively managing weeds using blind cultivation early with the tine weeder or the rotary hoe in some circumstances, and using inter-row cultivation. And so the goal really, from a soil health goal and reducing inputs, energy costs, labor costs, is to reduce the intensity and the frequency of tillage. We are managing these systems adaptively, so we had different amounts of tillage frequency across the 3 years. So this is just what happened on average is we reduced the number of disturbance events or tillage or cultivation events by about 50% in the no-till system. And we measured the intensity of the disturbance using the Russell Stir Index that NRCS has, and we reduced the intensity of disturbance in the no-till system by about 50% as well. Here's what weed control looked like between the two systems. And so this fancy figure here is the till system this is the 3-year average, tilled versus no-till, total weed biomass or kind of weed pressure in the two systems, and it's broken out by the weeds that occurred in row versus between the row. Okay, and so what you can see is that we didn't see a difference in weed pressure, at least statistically. We saw greater weed pressure occurring in row. Question?
Just going back on the slides, but have you tried planting your no-till green? Did you see it better?
Yeah, so we're very interested in that. We've kind of been following what Aaron's tried in the past couple of years, and we're gonna try that. We're thinking about we need another. I'm going to talk a little bit about stand establishment issues, but we're rethinking. We need another tool for better stand establishment. Okay, so on average, no difference, but very different years across the tilled and the no-till systems, and it's totally driven by environmental conditions. So we had one failure out of 3 years in the tilled system. Somebody asked yesterday in the questions about what happens when it rains and you can't get in and do blind cultivation, and that's exactly what happened. We had a really warm year in 2016 at planting, so the beans got up really quick, and it rained right after we planted. We couldn't get in tine weed before they got up. They got into the crook stage before we could get back in. It was another couple days before it dried up so we could tine weed, and we had a mat of giant foxtail in row that we couldn't take out with blind cultivation. The weed control failure in the high residue environment, we had just across the board in corn and in beans, we had a tough weed year. And so I think that this uptick in weed pressure in the no-till system is related to weed seed bank density. And that's where I started my talk, and I'll end my talk talking about that. Okay, so what about weed community shifts in the two different systems? One, at the site where this experiment is located, if you looked at weed community composition over a 6 or 7 year period, you would see that we're increasing our selection for giant foxtail in this system. Question is why? Well, a couple of different factors. We are using tillage, and I suggested that annual grasses are a little bit tougher to control and get out with cultivation. We end up planting corn and soybeans around the same time in late May to early June at this site. If you look at weed seed or weed germination periodicity for the Northeast, that's the sweet spot for giant foxtail in comparison to other species. So there's probably a couple different reasons. But we do see some weed shifts occurring. So we see more common ragweed in the no-till system, and we see more pigweed species in lamb's quarter in the tilled system. Okay, yield-wise, over the 3 years, we had about a 4 bushel difference between tilled and no-till, a little higher in the tilled system. And the yield limiting factor, getting back to the gentleman's question here, we did some fancy statistics that we thought that the difference in yields between these two systems would be driven by weed pressure or would be driven by stand establishment. And we found that stand establishment was an issue in both systems, and weed pressure was an issue in both systems that contributed to yield losses, but it wasn't driven by our tillage system. Okay? And so we still see this 4 bushel difference. We're thinking if it's not related to weeds and it's not related to stands, it must be related to either fertility or maybe sluggish soybeans getting out of that mulch is contributing to some yield loss. Do I have 15 more minutes? Is that right? Do I have 15 more?
Yeah, 15 more.
Okay. Okay, so just to wrap that up, so as far as the economics, how did this price out? I mentioned at the beginning, we're decreasing the number of.
comment from the previous slide. It's amazing how we found the exact same thing. I mean, we constantly see like a 3 to 4 bushel an acre yield drag. And like we showed yesterday, you know, whether it's because the beans are just a little bit later in development, or we also, as we showed yesterday, there's like only half the nodulation at that late July period in the no-till system. So we're seeing the exact same thing, the exact same like consistent percentage of yield drag, and it's like you're seeing too, it's not consistently related to stand or weeds. So I was a little bit distracted, but you have till 2:30.
Okay, great. All right. I'll slow down just a little bit then. So in the no-till system, I mentioned we kind of reduced the frequency of these cultivation events or tillage passes in this phase of the rotation. And so we kind of we decreased inputs a little bit in that system, but that didn't make up for, you know, if you're getting if there are $20 bushel beans and you have a 4 bushel difference on average, you know, a couple more tillage passes didn't break out even. So we're still doing a little bit better in the full tillage system, but not a whole lot of difference and not a statistical difference. Okay, so some just general, I just want to end this kind of the no-till semi-annual cash crop portion with a couple lessons learned. So I mentioned I don't want to downplay the importance of having a good cover crop in place and the importance of producing enough biomass. But in my experience, and at least from looking at the data, I think that when you have multiple tactics in place, so high seeding rates, you have the ability to use the high-residue cultivator, so you're thinking about, you have these tools in place. I think what's driving the system is weed seed bank pressure, and so we need to think about managing weed seed banks throughout the profile so that we're setting ourselves up to be successful for a no-till approach. Okay, so lower seed banks means lower weed pressure in those systems. Again, just to reiterate, we're still struggling with stand establishment. We're looking for new approaches. We're interested in the planting green approach. We now have residue slicers that we're going to use with the integrated rollers and actually pull up the row cleaners. Okay, so we're going to try out that approach as well. In no-till corn, we struggle with stand establishment and nitrogen availability. So not nitrogen supply, nitrogen synchrony with cash crop corn demand. Okay, so we think that that's still the hurdle that we need to overcome. I think there was a whole hour on termination yesterday, and so I'm just going to suggest that we struggle with having complete termination, both the rye monoculture and as well when we're trying to roll hairy vetch mixtures. It's not related to biomass. That's the other thing that we found. It's related to a lot of interacting factors, soil moisture conditions, how well you've leveled the seeding surface in the fall that you're rolling down. So there's lots of issues related to that. This is just a picture that illustrates that. So here, this doesn't look too good, and we've moved away from early termination. And you would think that that's going to cause a problem, both from maybe a yield drag, but also those seeds going to setting seed. If you go a little bit too late, if you don't hit that magic sweet spot as far as rolling down at fully on thesis and end up having to go a little bit later, you run the risk of having mature seed set, and you can also run into problems going late. There's other things going on that we've been trying to tease apart too in these systems. So it's been really driven by kind of how do we set ourselves up to be kind of set the agronomics and the weed control to be successful. But what we found when we looked at different kind of integrated weed management tactics, delaying termination and using supplemental weed control, what we found that in the corn system in particularly, we're influencing things like having conservation beneficial insects, predatory arthropods in the system. And so what we found was in each year of the transition in our first phase, we saw a pretty linear increase in the amount of beneficial predatory arthropods in the system. And we saw that when we delayed termination, we actually increased predatory arthropods. And so these are things that would be controlling early season insect pests. a lot of crabid beetles that are weed seed predators, and so I just wanted to mention that. Okay, so I mentioned weed seed bank management is kind of what I see as really the key for setting ourselves to be successful in no-till planting summer annual cash crops. And so one of the things that we looked at in the last phase of this ROSE project was reducing tillage intensity and frequency in a winter grain phase of the annual rotation. And so this is particularly important in Pennsylvania because what we're seeing is this push for more grain production and less, we're seeing less forage. I would say that the outlook is less perennial forages in our state due to the struggling dairies, okay? And there's a tremendous demand for grain. And so we have people interested in transitioning to organic that are grain farmers. And they're going to want to do this in an annual rotation in which they're producing a cash crop each year. And so the idea is we know that from soil health and from a weed seed bank management standpoint, having that perennial phase, that forage phase in the rotation is a tremendous benefit from driving down weed seed banks and lowering soil disturbance for a while. What we're interested in is if we can kind of perennialize a phase of an annual rotation by no-till planting winter annual cash crops, underseeding red clover, and having a period of over a year and a half in which we don't have any primary tillage occurring. So the way that we're doing that is after beans are coming in, the holdup is how do you supply nitrogen to your winter grain cash crop if you do need to. And so again, we're planting spelt and we're using a manure injector to provide the N, liquid dairy manure. The first year we did that, the manure injector was set up on 30-inch rows, and we saw some really cool striped banding phenomenons occurring in our winter grains. So we put splitters on, and now we're using manure injection on 15-inch centers. And so I don't know that this is necessary, but we actually, when we frost seed red clover into our winter grain, we drill it in. Lots of people are successful just broadcasting in, but it's just something we've been doing. And then we're adaptively managing post-harvest after the spelt comes off. We're managing that phase either by being proactive and opportunistic in taking a forage cut if we have a good stand of red clover, or we're using it as a weed management phase and trying to knock down those foxtails and ragweeds that tend to come on after harvesting our winter grain crop. Okay, so from a weed management standpoint, I started talking about how tillage disturbance creates the disturbance that's the mechanism for turning on germination cues. I think we are targeting 50 units of N. His question was how much manure were we applying? Yep. Yeah. Okay, so from just thinking about weed management, so we are, when we're doing this, we're planting a winter annual cash crop, okay? And so that means that we have no disturbance in May and June where we would have really high weed pressure from summer annual weeds in a summer annual cash crop, okay? So that's one mechanism. We're potentially turning germination cues off. We're also adding, we're reducing the level of disturbance in the fall, and we have defoliation events in place, okay? And so we're still getting a cash crop in the summer. We're going to go into corn the following year. We come out of beans, but we go a whole year and a half without any primary tillage. So this is what the data looked like. We had 4 systems, and I'm just pointing out here. This is the system in which we did that. We no-till planted the spelt in the winter. We underseeded red clover. We have some systems where we use different strategies, and we're comparing. These are higher intensity tillage winter grain phases. You can see that on average over the 3 years, we had maybe a little bit higher variability, but on average, we did just as well as far as spelt yields. This is weed biomass taken in the cash crop during the summer season. You can see again, we see a little more variability in how much weed pressure we had, but on average we were either no difference or maybe a little bit less weed pressure in the no-till winter grain. This graph shows you different transitions. So we measured the weed seed bank density in the winter coming out of soybeans. So this is after the spelt had been planted. And we came back the spring before planting corn, so at the end of this spelt cover crop transition. So we would be sampling in March where we had just the red clover in place, okay? And so we wanted to see if there was a difference between reducing the intensity of tillage on how well we did in driving down weed seed banks. And what we found was we did just as well, and we actually started out with as low of a weed seed bank in this transition. And so from a weed ecology standpoint, I find this very interesting and exciting. And so it's something that we're going to continue to look at because it's an important rotational component to setting ourselves up to being successful when we go back to summer annual cash crops. Okay. So I think I have enough time to just mention interseeding. This is a little out of place because I'm going to suggest that there's not a whole lot of in-season benefit to weed management from interseeding cover crops, but one of the big things in Pennsylvania is, as far as a nutrient management standpoint and their conservation plans, how do they meet T? How do we prevent soil erosion potential when we're growing corn for a cash grain? And so we have trouble establishing a cover crop. We have a pretty limited growing season. I'm sure it's very similar in Wisconsin. So what we've learned from interseeding experiments and research at Penn State and conventional no-till systems over the past 10 or 15 years or so, we tried to apply to organic systems. And so this work, we had on-farm research trials with 3 different organic grain farms in Pennsylvania, and we were also doing it on station in State College. And we just wanted to see what were kind of the trade-offs, what were maybe the potential pitfalls on working organic farms as far as accomplishing interseeding, and what are some of the benefits and trade-offs related to doing that. And so we wanted to compare either using the drill interseeding approach, which in a no-till system we think has a tremendous benefit from having more consistent seed-to-soil contact, better establishment in comparison to broadcasting. In a full-tillage organic system, where you're doing that last cultivation, there's the potential that you could just be broadcasting cover crops in there. And so we were comparing the benefits of drill interseeding to broadcasting. So you can see this is what it looked like at one of the farms that we were working on. That last cultivation occurs probably a day or two prior to not being able to get a tractor through the field, right? So they're doing that last one to try to maybe throw some soil in the row, get those last couple weeds that they didn't get with earlier passes. And so there's a very small window agronomically and a labor crunch for probably doing this. And so that we're recognizing that's one challenge. What we found from this research was that in comparison to broadcasting, there was really only a marginal benefit of drill interseeding. And so we did this across 3 farms in 1 year in which we had really timely rains, and it was set up to be, the year was really set up to be successful. And we were successful interseeding with doing it broadcast and drilling, and there wasn't a whole lot of difference. Where we saw a little bit of a benefit was in the second year when it was drier, and so there was a benefit as far as getting a little better seed-to-soil contact in drill interseeding. What we did see was we saw a difference in cover crop expression, and so our strategy was in corn we wanted to have good weed suppression potential in the fall, and we wanted good nitrogen scavengers, and so we interseeded annual ryegrass, orchard grass, and forage radish. And what we found was the way that you interseed, the establishment method, influenced the expression of the mixture. So when we drilled the cover crop, the composition was dominated by forage radish. Bigger seed does a little bit better when you place it in the soil, or outcompetes smaller seeds. So that was one thing that we found. We also found, and I've heard this today or yesterday as well, that this is, the potential, the interseeding potential for fall biomass production is driven by light transmittance. So there's been some work that's demonstrated that at Cornell, Matt Ryan's program. And in organic systems, it's also, we think, driven by fertility, all right? So these are high fertility environments, and so that's going to play a role. This research just shows that one of the questions is how much cover crop in the fall is a successful cover crop? Is it 200 pounds, 400 pounds? You need 800 pounds of dry matter to make it successful. And so one of the things we were trying to understand is were these cover crops reducing nitrate leaching in the fall and early spring? And we found that at least one of the 3 locations there was an effect and a benefit from having the cover crops established using interseeding. Okay, the final thing is the growers that we worked with. One of the growers was a small dairyman, and he, at that particular site, he had some lower corn populations and some higher biomass production from his interseeded cover crops. So that's what it looked like at that particular site when we took off corn. And he was quite excited about that because that field was pretty close to his barn. He was going to run out the cows and get some late season foraging. And so that's driving some excitement in Pennsylvania, at least with dairy folks. Okay, so that's all I had. I want to thank you all for listening, and I'm really happy to be here. Some of the information I talked today you can find in the Penn State Organic Crop Guide. We're going to update it this coming year. And it has the basics. It doesn't have everything you might be looking for, but it's a good resource. Okay. Great.
They're not related questions, but did you ever check the water infiltration rates between the no-till versus the full-till?
No. So that's a great question.
Because that might actually, I mean, you're losing on average 2 to 3 bushel in the no-till. Yeah. Ideally.
Right.
You might be storing more water.
Could be storing, yeah. So there's lots of dynamics occurring with the water cycle, yeah. Right? So I think I've heard people, somebody speak earlier to in the spring it's drawing out a lot of soil moisture, and in a wet year that's a benefit. If you get dry after planting, that's a negative. If you get dry later in the growing season and you have that mulch, it's a benefit, right? And so infiltration is just another one of those dynamics that comes into play.
And you talked about not tilling for about 1.5 years.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of a break on that rule, but have you considered tining the cover crop in the spring when it's 2 to 3 inches to see if that would help with the weed suppression once you roll it?
In rye?
In the rye, yeah. They tine in Europe on the small grains.
Yeah. So I think that's a good question. So we haven't tried spring tine weeding in an established rye cover crop. And my guess is that there's not going to be a whole lot of benefit because we don't really see summer annual weed pressure until rye would be, boot stage, well established, and full canopy. And so I don't think that the windows line up for being successful with tine weeding, at least in our area.
When you're looking at interseeding and adding that biomass from a soil loss standpoint, going through Russell, are you getting enough there to really move the needle? Or what's your outcome in your calculations and looking at it in your systems?
Yeah, so we haven't done enough to actually plug it into Russell, but a lot of the early work was thinking about nitrogen cycling and not soil erosion loss. But we've been hearing more and more about that being a pretty significant issue. And I would say that we're not moving with the establishment that we've seen. We're not consistent enough to move the needle. And so I think on dairy farms where, these guys are maybe dropping 31, 30 plant population, you have a little bit of thinning a little cultivator blight, we seem to do better in those situations than in cash grain operations that are really driving up population rates. They're growing bigger corn. We struggle there. So there's, that's kind of where we're at, both on the organic side and the conventional side, is that we think this really has potential in a dairy system. In a cash grain system, we need to do something differently if we're going to consistently establish cover crops interseeding.
Has anybody tried or heard of spraying molasses on like a full tillage to suppress weeds? Anybody here?
So I haven't. If anybody has an anecdote, we could share that.
I was told some Amish farmers do this over here with success. They also look at the moon phases and all that for terminating weeds, but
Yeah, I guess I'm struggling coming up with the mechanism there, but
Has anybody worked on the triggers and trying to come up with something that triggers that weed seed to germinate maybe the end of September so we can winter kill it?
so that's a good question. I mean, we see shifts naturally occur in some of those. So like, take lamb's quarter for an example. That graph I showed, there was a couple different peaks. There was kind of a big peak in May, early June, and then a smaller tail in late season. And depending on your production system, you can see shifts in lamb's quarter, so where you see a lot more later emergence of lamb's quarter. And so like we see that a lot in like after small grains, where we see a flush of lamb's quarter in September. And the problem is these weeds, they're entirely genetically set up to survive. So the lamb's quarter might be this big, but it has a seed head on it that's produced enough seed to replenish the seed bank. So that's always going to be the challenge. They have a stronger will to survive. That's what weeds are.
You mentioned that you had trouble terminating the rye, and I was wondering if you guys attempted rolling multiple times at all?
Yeah, so I left that part out. So one of the things, not intentionally, I think I just forgot. So we've gone to a double roll system in order to improve termination efficacy. You can do it a couple different ways. And so we've tried, what we thought would be a really nice approach was you run the orange crush at the head of the tractor, and you use the rollers as well behind and plant in one pass. In order to run the vacuum on the planter and the front hitch and the down pressure on the hydraulic rollers, we're like one hydraulic line short to be able to do that in one pass. So we do it in two passes, and we space it a couple days apart prior to emergence. And I think anecdotally, I don't think that research has demonstrated this, that there's probably a benefit to spacing out the two passes. So you kind of you get some bounce back, right? And you let it bounce back, and then you hit it again. And if you can kind of offset, a lot of times the reason why you're getting bounce back is that you don't. I think I heard Jeff yesterday talk about the anvil and the hammer. Like we're not getting the soil contact because we're either high centered or low centered in different spots of the field. So if it's possible to move over and get it, we've tried that as well.
Can you talk about how the row spacing of rye does weed control, and a little more specifically about how we're secreting the oligopathic effect and how that interplays?
So we, I think some early work, we had a grain drill that was set up on 5-inch spacing, and so most grain drills are set up on 7.5. And so there was some earlier work that looked at if there was some benefit to moving to narrower rows, and I think that, I don't remember, I think it might have shown that there was a little bit of benefit. The problem is just, that's typically you're going to find grain drills on 7.5-inch spacing, so that's kind of what we're working with. The allelopathy, what was your question again? Yeah. Yes, so...
There was more a specific question about the allelopathy, if it's coming from the roots and the distribution.
Yeah, so, you know, the chemical that's in, that's been identified, it's called DBOA, in rye, is throughout the plant. And I guess maybe I'm kind of stepping on beyond my expertise. But I believe that there's some root exudation, but where you see the greatest pulse of that occurring is when you turn it in, right? When you turn in the rye cover crop, all right? So this is, again, it's getting back to that this secondary compound, this allelopathic chemical, has to be in soil solution, and has the weeds, it's inhibiting root growth of weeds as it's taken up.
All right, we should probably end there to transition to the next topic. But let's thank John for his presentation.